The last day of October, 1881. A wind that carried the scent of distant snow swept down from the plains and rattled the loose planks of the old barn. Inside, where the air was thick with the dust of hay and memory, Susanna Prynne ran a gloved finger over a line of faded script in her mother's ledger. Her breath plumed white in the cold. Beside her, her twin sister Temperance tested the heft of a rusted scythe, her movements slow and deliberate, as if weighing the tool not for its use but for its history. They were 18 years old, and the world had shrunk to this patch of hard Nebraska soil, the leaning farmhouse, and the cavernous barn left to them by a fever that had taken their parents in the space of a single week. Everything they owned was recorded in the ledger Susanna held: 2 milk cows, a dozen laying hens, 3 acres of fallow cornfield, and a debt to the mercantile that felt heavier than the barn itself. Temperance set the scythe down, the metal ringing softly against the packed earth floor. She nudged a loose fieldstone at the base of the foundation with the toe of her boot. It shifted more than a stone ought to. They were just girls, the town whispered. They wouldn't last the winter. But a person's world can be remade inside a cold barn, with a single loose stone. Temperance knelt, her brow furrowed in concentration. She worked her fingers into the gap around the stone, the dirt cold and gritty beneath her nails. Susanna closed the ledger and came to her side, holding the lantern closer. The stone was not part of the foundation wall, but set within it, a careful deception. With a final grunt of effort, Temperance pulled it free. It came away with a scraping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet barn. Behind it was not more stone, but darkness. A hollow space that smelled of stale air and something else, something faint and yeasty, like bread forgotten for a generation. The lantern light trembled, casting their long shadows against the hay bales as it probed the opening. It was a doorway, low and narrow, framed by hand-hewn timbers. A thick wooden door, bound with iron straps, was set deep into the wall. There was no handle, only a small, keyhole-shaped opening cut into the wood, dark and uninviting. This barn had been their playground as children, a world of haylofts and hidden corners they thought they knew completely. But they had never known this. It was a secret their parents had either not known or never shared. A silence kept for reasons that were now buried with them. Susanna reached out and touched the cold iron of the door, a strange sense of reverence settling over her. This was something older than them, older than their parents' time on this land. It felt like a beginning, though they stood at the precipice of what felt like an end. The keyhole was the first puzzle. There was no key on any of the rings left in the farmhouse kitchen. They spent a day searching, turning out dusty boxes and forgotten drawers, but found nothing. It was Temperance, patient and methodical, who solved it. She remembered a small, wrought-iron key their grandmother used to wear on a leather cord around her neck, a thing she called her pantry key, though it opened no pantry they had ever seen. After their grandmother passed, their mother had tucked it away in a small rosewood box with her own mother's locket and a bundle of letters. They found the box at the bottom of a cedar chest, and the key inside, black with age. It fit the lock perfectly. The mechanism inside was stiff with disuse, groaning in protest as Temperance turned the key with both hands. With a final, heavy clunk, the bolt slid back. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening into a chamber of profound darkness. The air that rolled out was cooler than the barn, carrying that same phantom scent of yeast, but also of stone, and earth, and long, uninterrupted sleep. Holding the lantern high, they crossed the threshold together, stepping out of their known world and into a place that had been waiting for them. The room was not large, perhaps 15 feet square, with a low, vaulted ceiling of brick. The walls were stone, meticulously fitted. In the center stood a massive, beehive-shaped oven, its brick mouth gaping like a silent O. A thick layer of dust and cobwebs coated everything, softening the hard edges of a long workbench, a set of empty wooden shelves, and a collection of strange tools, long-handled wooden peels, heavy dough troughs, and lidded crocks sealed with hardened wax. It was a bakery. A hidden, secret bakery, built into the very foundation of their lives. A place of warmth and sustenance, left to fall into cold silence. On the workbench, a smaller ledger lay open, its pages stiff and yellowed. Susanna picked it up gently. The script was her grandmother's. The first entry was dated 1852. Built the oven, it read. The town needs bread, but does not need to know my business. The discovery settled upon them not with a sense of triumph, but with a profound and somber weight. This hidden room was a legacy, a testament to a grandmother they remembered as a quiet woman who smelled of sage and chamomile, but who clearly possessed a will of iron and a secret industry. Susanna spent the next 2 days reading the old ledger by candlelight while Temperance began the monumental task of cleaning. The dust of 3 decades was shoveled out in buckets. Spiders were evicted from their ancestral homes in the corners of the brick oven. The stone floor was scrubbed with lye soap and creek water until the flag shone dark and clean in the lantern light. The grandmother's notes were not a diary of feelings, but a meticulous record of work. She wrote of milling her own flour, of coaxing a wild yeast starter to life, of the precise ratio of water to flour needed on a humid day versus a dry one. She detailed the construction of the oven, explaining how the thick clay and brick dome was designed to hold heat for hours, allowing for dozens of loaves to be baked with a single firing of wood. It was a book of knowledge, of survival passed down through ink and paper. As she read, Susanna understood the secrecy. Their grandmother, a woman who came from the old country with strange ways and a different tongue, had built a stronghold of self-reliance against a world that was often suspicious of outsiders. She had provided for herself, on her own terms. Therefore, her granddaughters would do the same. They did not speak of it, but the purpose formed between them, as solid as the stone walls. They would bring this place back to life. They would bake. They would fill the empty shelves with bread, and that bread would be their insurance against the coming winter, against the town's pity, and against the predatory patience of Mr. Alden at the mercantile. He owned their debt, and he visited once a week, his eyes lingering on their fields, his voice dripping with false concern. 2 young ladies alone, he would say, shaking his head. It is a heavy burden. I would not wish to see you fail. He was waiting for them to fail. He was waiting for the first heavy snow to break their spirit so he could claim their land for pennies on the dollar. But Mr. Alden did not know about the room of stone and brick. He did not know about their grandmother's ledger. He did not know what 2 determined women could accomplish when the world had left them with nothing but each other and a legacy of quiet work. The bakery was not just a room, it was an inheritance of fortitude. The first great task was the oven. The grandmother's oven was a masterpiece of old-world engineering, but it was only one. The ledger spoke of baking 40 loaves at a time, but Susanna, looking at the empty shelves that lined one entire wall, knew it was not enough. If they were to do this, they would do it right. They needed more capacity. They needed to build. Temperance, who had always possessed a builder's hands, took charge. Following the detailed diagrams in the ledger, she mapped out plans for 2 smaller, identical ovens to flank the large one. The project consumed them. They rose before dawn and worked until their muscles ached and their hands were raw. They hauled stones from the creek bed, their backs straining against the weight. They needed clay, and the ledger specified a certain type, rich and grey, from a deposit a mile upriver. An old man, a trapper named Phineas who lived in a cabin set far from town, saw them one morning as they dug the heavy clay into burlap sacks. He watched them for a long time from the cover of the trees, his face weathered as an old root. He had known their grandmother. He approached without a sound, making them both jump. That clay needs sand, he said, his voice a low rasp. And horsehair, if you can get it. For temper. Keeps it from cracking when the heat comes. He offered no other help, just that small, vital piece of information, and then he was gone. It was the first kindness they had received since the funeral, a piece of practical advice instead of a pitying glance. They mixed the clay, sand, and straw in a great wooden trough, trampling it with their bare feet until it was the perfect consistency. They built wooden forms for the arches of the oven doors and the vaulted ceilings, just as the ledger instructed. It was grueling, punishing work. They mortared the stones together with the wet clay, their fingers chapped and bleeding. The first oven they built cracked during its initial curing fire, a long, spiderweb fissure appearing in the dome as it cooled. It was a heartbreaking failure. Temperance sat before the ruined oven, her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Susanna saw a flicker of despair in her sister's eyes. But Susanna opened the grandmother's ledger to a heavily annotated page. The first dome cracked, she read aloud. Too much water in the clay. The fire was too hot, too fast. Patience is an ingredient. The words, written 3 decades prior, were a comfort and a command. They tore down the ruined oven and began again. This time, they were more patient. They let the clay structure dry for a full week before lighting a small, slow fire inside, a fire they fed twig by twig for 3 days, gradually increasing its intensity, curing the clay until it was as hard as rock. When it was done, the 3 ovens stood side by side, 1 large, 2 small, their brick mouths ready. They had turned stone and mud and sweat into a factory for their own salvation. With the ovens complete, their focus shifted to the bread itself. In a cool corner of the bakery, they had found their grandmother's greatest treasure, a heavy stoneware crock containing a dry, flaky substance. The ledger identified it as her sourdough starter, carefully dehydrated for preservation. It sleeps, the entry read. Wake it with warm water and rye flour. Feed it and it will live again. It is the soul of the bread. Following the instructions, Susanna mixed a small amount of the flakes with water and flour in a bowl. For 2 days, nothing happened. They feared it was truly dead, a relic with no life left in it. Then, on the 3rd morning, they entered the bakery to the faintest sour-sweet smell. The mixture in the bowl was bubbling, alive with microscopic life. It had slept for 30 years and had woken for them. This living inheritance felt more valuable than gold. Their first attempts at baking were clumsy. They produced loaves that were dense as bricks and others that were burnt to charcoal. But with each failure, they learned. Susanna would record every detail in her own ledger, which she kept beside her grandmother's: the temperature of the water, the time the dough was left to rise, the heat of the oven floor. Temperance developed a feel for the dough, learning to read its texture, its elasticity, its readiness, with her hands. They fell into a rhythm. The work was a solace, a physical act that pushed aside their grief. The days were filled with the repetitive, grounding tasks of feeding the starter, mixing the dough, shaping the loaves, and firing the ovens. The air in the barn now carried the constant, life-affirming scent of baking bread. They began to stockpile. They made careful, weekly trips to the mercantile for flour, salt, and yeast, never buying so much at once that it would arouse Mr. Alden's suspicion. He would watch them, a small, knowing smile on his face. Stocking up for winter, are we? A wise precaution for 2 young ladies. He saw their small purchases as the desperate, futile acts of children. He could not imagine the scale of their operation, the hundreds of pounds of flour that were being transformed into neat rows of cooling loaves on the bakery shelves. Each loaf was a brick in a fortress they were building against the future. They worked in secret, mostly at night, the glow from the hidden bakery's door the only sign of their labor, a warm, orange light that no one in the town of Redemption ever saw. The first snow came in mid-November, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a warning. A week later, a real storm blew in from the north, a blizzard that buried the world in a foot of white and lasted for 2 days. The stagecoach, which brought mail and supplies from the east, was delayed. Then it was cancelled. A quiet tension began to settle over the town. People's conversations in front of the mercantile grew shorter, their faces tighter. Mr. Alden's store was the town's entire pantry, and its shelves were not inexhaustible. He began a subtle form of rationing. A family could only buy 1 sack of flour, 1 side of bacon. And the prices began to creep upward. A sack of flour that cost $1 last month now cost $2. Supply and demand, he would say with a shrug, as if he were a victim of the circumstances he was so masterfully exploiting. Another blizzard hit the first week of December, even more ferocious than the last. It sealed the pass through the mountains, cutting them off completely. The town was an island in a sea of snow. Panic, cold and sharp, began to take hold. The stores in people's root cellars dwindled. The deer and rabbits were driven deep into the forests by the heavy snow, and the hunters returned empty-handed. In the barn, the sisters worked relentlessly. The shelves in the hidden bakery were now full. Hundreds of dark, crusty loaves of sourdough bread, rye bread, and simple white bread stood in neat, fragrant rows. They had a mountain of food, a secret abundance in a town that was beginning to starve. They heard the stories on their trips into town. The blacksmith's youngest child was sick with a fever, too weak from hunger to fight it. The widow Jensen had been seen digging for frozen turnips in her garden, her hands raw and blue with cold. The whispers turned against them. Mr. Alden, in his cunning way, deflected the town's growing fear onto the two sisters. The Prynne girls seemed to be doing just fine, he would comment loudly enough for others to hear. Always buying flour. Must have quite a stockpile out there. Some people only think of themselves. The seeds of resentment were planted. The town that had pitied them now began to resent them. They were hoarders. They were selfish. They were alone, and the town was slowly turning its back on them, just as it had on their grandmother a generation before. The breaking point came just before Christmas. A third blizzard, the worst of all, descended upon Redemption and did not relent for 4 days. The snow drifted up to the eaves of the houses. The world was a white, silent prison. The last of the town's shared provisions were gone. Mr. Alden, fearing a riot, nailed his mercantile doors shut from the inside, protecting his own family and his remaining stock. The church bell, which usually rang on Sunday mornings, remained silent. There was no strength left for faith. The town was starving. In their farmhouse, Susanna and Temperance ate their bread with a thin broth, the warmth of their small stove a stark contrast to the cold desperation that had seized the town. They could hear the wind howling, a lonely and mournful sound. They had done it. They had survived. Their shelves were full. But their victory felt hollow, tasteless as ash in their mouths. Survival was not meant to be a solitary prize. Their grandmother had built the bakery because the town needed bread. She had kept it a secret because she feared their judgment, not because she wished them ill. That night, sitting at their small kitchen table, Susanna looked at her sister. No words were needed. The same thought was reflected in Temperance's weary eyes. They had prepared for winter, but they had not prepared for this, the moral weight of their own abundance. They could remain safe in their fortress of bread while their neighbors withered, or they could risk everything. To reveal their secret now, in the depths of the town's desperation, could be dangerous. A hungry mob might not be grateful, it might simply be a mob, tearing apart their barn, their home, their lives, to get at the food. Mr. Alden would surely use it against them, branding them as thieves or worse. But to do nothing was a different kind of death. It was a hardening of the heart, a betrayal of the very legacy they had worked so hard to reclaim. Patience is an ingredient, Susanna said softly, quoting her grandmother's ledger. Temperance nodded slowly. And so is courage. Their decision was made. Not with a grand pronouncement, but in the quiet understanding that passed between two souls who had only ever had each other. They would not let their town die. That night, under the cold, unpitying light of a sliver of moon, they put their plan into action. They loaded a large wooden sled with dozens of loaves of bread, the crust still faintly warm from the ovens. The snow was deep, the air so cold it burned their lungs. Pulling the heavy sled together, they made their way the half-mile into the silent, sleeping town. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the snow and their own ragged breathing. They looked like ghosts in the white landscape, two small figures engaged in a secret act of grace. They left the sled, piled high with its impossible bounty, on the steps of the church. They did not leave a note. They did not wait to be seen. They simply left the bread and vanished back into the snow-swept darkness. The next morning, a cry went up in the town. People emerged from their homes to find a miracle. Bread. Beautiful, real, life-sustaining bread. At first, no one knew where it had come from. They called it a gift from God, a Christmas miracle. The pastor distributed the loaves, a single loaf for each family, enough to quell the worst of the hunger for a day. That night, Susanna and Temperance did it again. Another sled, another journey through the biting cold, another mountain of bread left on the church steps. The next day, the town's gratitude was mixed with a burning curiosity. This was no miracle from the heavens, this was the work of human hands. But whose? The old trapper, Phineas, who had been watching the town's decline from his isolated cabin, saw the faint tracks leading from the town back towards the Prynne homestead. He understood. He had seen the smoke from their barn on still nights, smelled the faint scent of baking on the wind. He had known their grandmother, and he recognized her quiet, stubborn brand of charity. He made his own journey into town and spoke a few quiet words to the pastor. He did not name names. He simply said, "Some seeds are planted in secret, Pastor." The harvest is not always meant for the farmer alone, the pastor understood. The secret acts of kindness were a rebuke to the town's own failings, its own lack of faith and community. On the third morning, as the people gathered for their daily bread, Mr. Alden emerged from his fortified mercantile. He had seen the bread, and his face was a mask of cold fury. His power over the town was built on their dependence, and that power was crumbling. He had his suspicions, and now he would voice them. He saw Susanna and Temperance standing at the edge of the small crowd, their faces pale and tired, and he pointed a finger at them. "There," he shouted, his voice cracking in the cold air. "There are your miracle workers. The Prynne sisters. Where did 2 orphan girls get all this bread? They have been hoarding, stealing from us all along. This is stolen flour, stolen grain." A murmur went through the crowd. His accusation hung in the air, plausible and poisonous. The townspeople looked from Alden to the 2 sisters, their faces a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. For a moment, it seemed Alden's venom would work. But then the pastor stepped forward, holding up a loaf of the dark, crusty sourdough. He looked not at the sisters, but directly at Mr. Alden. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This bread was given freely, when we had nothing," he said, his voice clear and steady. "And what bread have you offered, Mr. Alden?" The question was simple, and it was devastating. It cut through all the fear and resentment and laid the truth bare. Alden had locked his doors. The sisters had opened their hearts. The crowd turned, as one, to look at the mercantile owner. They saw him not as a leader, but as a jailer. They saw his piety as a sham, his concern as a lie. His face went pale, then red. He stammered, but no words came. He was undone not by a mob, but by a quiet question and a loaf of bread. He stumbled back and retreated into his store, the sound of the bolt sliding home a final admission of his defeat. The people of redemption then turned to Susanna and Temperance, and for the first time, they truly saw them. They saw not 2 helpless girls, but the quiet strength that had saved them. No one spoke. Words were not needed. In their eyes was a look of profound, humbling gratitude, an apology, and a deep, abiding respect. The winter was not over, but the town of redemption had found its heart again. When the spring thaw finally came and the pass was cleared, the supply wagons rolled into town. But things were different now. The town no longer depended solely on Mr. Alden's mercantile or the whims of the seasons. The heart of the community had moved to the old Prynne homestead. The secret of the bakery was out, and it had become a place of gathering, a source of resilience. The sisters taught other women how to bake, sharing the knowledge from their grandmother's ledger. They established a fair trade with local farmers for grain, creating a local economy that was no longer beholden to a single man's greed. Mr. Alden eventually sold the mercantile and moved away, unable to bear the daily, silent judgment of the town he had tried to exploit. He was not punished or run out of town, he was simply rendered irrelevant, a fate far worse for a man of his pride. Susanna and Temperance never sought praise or power. They simply continued their work. The rhythm of their lives was still marked by the feeding of the starter, the kneading of the dough, and the firing of the ovens. They had faced the winter and the judgment of their neighbors and had answered with quiet competence and open hands. They had learned that survival was not just about stockpiling against scarcity, it was about creating abundance and sharing it. One cool evening in late autumn, a year after they had first found the loose stone, Susanna stood in the warm, fragrant air of the bakery. Temperance was pulling a final batch of loaves from the big oven, her face glowing in the heat. Susanna had her ledger open on the workbench. She wrote a single line on a fresh page, October 31st, 1882. "The shelves are full." The town is fed. The debt is paid. It was all that needed to be said. Outside, the same wind that had rattled the barn a year ago was blowing, carrying the same scent of distant snow. But it was no longer a threat. It was just the wind. The stone foundation was solid, the ovens were hot, and the bread was rising. Some things are built to endure.